Okay, hey everybody. Today we're going to talk about group behavior. Okay, so questions we want to consider are how is our behavior affected by the presence of others? What are group polarization and groupthink? And how much power do we have as individuals within a group? Finally, we'll look at how cultural norms can affect our behavior. Just briefly, right? There's a lot to go into on that last one, but we'll just kind of talk about it generally. So, the topics for today, we're going to talk about social facilitation, social loafing, de-individuation, group polarization, groupthink, the power of the individual, and then some cultural influences. All right, it's pretty straightforward today. So, how is our behavior affected by the presence of others? Well, if we're talking about social facilitation, think of this example. It's pretty simple, but it's one of the first recorded examples, right? 1898. When asked to wind a fishing rod as fast as you can, Norman Triplett, this guy, one researcher, he found that adolescents would wind the fishing reel faster if they were in the presence of somebody else doing the same thing, right? So if they were asked to wind the fishing rod, in this case, as fast as they could by themselves, they wouldn't do it as fast if somebody else was also there doing the same thing. Suggesting that, right, the presence of others actually makes us better at certain tasks. So, social facilitation is the idea that we have improved performance on simple or well-learned tasks when we're in the presence of others. On tougher tasks, so something we aren't good at or something we haven't practiced, we actually perform much worse in the presence of others. Okay, so it matters what the task is, right? Something easy and simple like winding a fishing rod, or even something more complex if you have practiced it. So think about a complex dance or a song that you have learned or written and you're performing. If you've practiced it, then you will improve performance in front of people. But if it's really difficult and you haven't practiced it, you're not good at it, you actually perform worse. So why is this, right? So when others observe us, right, it increases arousal of the sympathetic nervous system. This arousal amplifies our other reactions. Simply, it strengthens our most likely response. Now, if we have practiced the skill, our most likely response is to do that skill well. If it's a difficult task that we're not good at, the most likely response is to mess up. Right, so the social facilitation helps us do better on a task if it's an easy task or if it's well learned. But if it's difficult, right, that increased arousal, right, is actually going to be too much, and it's gonna make us do even worse. Okay, now let's apply this to like sports. So there's some data here, right? Teams tend to do better. Maybe you know this, right? They call it the home team advantage, right? The winning percentage at home for all these different sports is much higher than away games. So why is that? Well, if you think about it, right, you're more likely to do well in front of an audience, especially if that audience is a friendly audience, right? If they're a supportive audience, we're more likely to do well. So when teams play in front of a friendly audience at home, right, there's usually much more fans of that team at the home team, right? Right, that's a friendly audience. The players who have definitely practiced their skills will do better, and they tend to win more games. However, right, if you're performing in front of a bunch of people, even if they're friendly, and you're not good at it, right, then at the skill, whatever it is, say you've never played soccer before in your life, right, getting up in front of people and playing soccer, you're going to do even worse than you would have normally done. Okay, so it matters on if you practice the skill or if the skill is easy or difficult. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is social loafing. So the social loafing is a tendency for people in a group to exert less effort when pooling their efforts towards a common goal rather than being individually accountable. Right, just think of a group project that you have to do, and one person in the group, right, knows that, like, well, I'm going to get the same grade as everybody else, so I'm not going to do as much because I don't have to. That's essentially what we're talking about here. That's called social loafing. So what causes it? Well, the first thing I just mentioned, right, people, when they're part of a group, it's not all the accountability isn't on them, right? It's on the group as a whole. and therefore they worry less about what others think of them. Right? Group members may see their individual contributions as, dispensable. It's like, okay, I could do some, I could not. It's not going to affect anything. But also, right, since the group members are going to share in the benefits equally, right? Maybe if it's a school project, that's the grade, right? Regardless of how much they contribute, then some may slack off, right? Unless you're highly motivated or the group, or you're strongly identified with the group, right? You're really tied to your group, like it's a group of friends. People may just free ride on others' efforts, right? Basically, the idea here is it's like either you see your value as being indispensable, so it doesn't matter if you contribute or not, or maybe you notice like, well, we're going to get the same grade, or we're going to get the same prize or benefit, whatever it is, even if I don't contribute, so I'm not going to do anything, right? And that's social loafing, right? And that would not occur if the project was just for an individual, right? Because if you don't do anything, you're going to get a bad grade. But in this case, right, you're kind of free riding on other people's efforts. Okay, de-individuation. Okay, this is another concept, how our behavior is affected by the presence of others. So de-individuation is the loss of self-awareness and self-restraint, which occurs when you're in a group situation that fosters arousal and anonymity, right? So think about the internet bullies, internet trolls, right? They're much more likely to do things that they would not do in person, right? They lose that self-restraint, self-awareness because of the anonymity. Anytime there are nighttime protests with masks involved, police officers have their faces covered, right? So nighttime and masks lead to that anonymity, right? People that have sunglasses on and a bandana over their face, right? They become anonymous. You can't tell who they are. They're more likely to act a little more crazy, right? So in this example here, it's like somebody on the street during a riot, you ask them, in daylight later, they'll be like, wow, yeah, I can't believe how crazy I acted. Like I was so willing to do blah, 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 just act out in a certain way. It's because of the anonymity and the arousal, right? So sometimes it spills over, right? Sometimes like sporting events, right? The arousal people get from sporting events, right? You get pumped up from watching your team win, lose, doesn't really matter. Even win, let's say your team wins, right? You're still all pumped up. Then all that arousal carries onto the street, and sometimes there's riots and looting, right? Think about after big sports games like Super Bowl or whatever, right? Even the winning team's city sometimes gets trashed, right? And you're more likely to do that because of the group situation, because you have high arousal, and you'd be even more likely to do that if you were wearing some kind of mask, maybe face paint even, something that will foster anonymity, right? Something where you're hiding your identity. I'm sure you can think of other situations where this would happen. Okay, so we went over 3 concepts there. So make sure you know those 3 concepts: social facilitation, social loafing, and de-individuation. Okay, so take a moment, pause, and try to define those concepts in your own words. Okay, group polarization. So we're going to talk about group polarization, groupthink, and then how much power we have as individuals when we're in a group. So group polarization, right? This is the idea that we kind of enhance our inclinations or position or thoughts or beliefs when we talk about our beliefs with other like-minded people. Okay, so in this little experiment, that's where this data came from. They had 2 groups, a high prejudice group and a low prejudice group. Right, so they grouped them by like-mindedness, right? So they grouped all the high prejudice kids together, and they grouped all the low prejudice kids together, and I believe it says these are high school students. After having conversations within their group, right, so if you were put in the high prejudice group, you only had conversations with other kids that were ranked as high prejudice, and the same with the low prejudice group, you only had a conversation, right? So you're forming your bubble, your little bubble. And when you do that, you end up actually becoming more solidified in your position, right? The people in the high prejudice group became more prejudiced, and the people in the low prejudice group became less prejudiced after the discussion. Okay, so this is the idea of that bubble, right? And you can probably easily see this being translated to politics, right? In the age of the internet, we have all these places online where we can just go and talk to people that are just like us, and it's going to polarize us, right? It's going to make us even more extreme within our viewpoints. So the idea here is that if you have an ideological separation, so let's say politics, right? Right wing, left wing, right? Conservative versus liberal. When you have that separation of ideologies, and then you add deliberation, meaning you're only talking to people within your group, that increases the polarization between those groups. Each group is going to move further into their position and further away from one another. So this is what feeds extremism and suicide terrorism, right? Basically, you find yourself in a group. You came in, you were kind of extreme, but you weren't that extreme. But the more you talk to these people, the more and more extreme you get, which can lead to, in the extreme cases, terrorism, suicide terrorism. Right, as they interact in isolation, their views go more and more extreme. Increasingly, what happens is you categorize the world as us versus them, right? Us against them is the mindset. It's that tribalism mindset. And the more we only talk to people in our own groups, the more extreme we get, the more the world becomes us against them, which will lead to acts of extreme violence sometimes, right? That's where it comes from. That's where these extreme violent acts come from. So when you ask, how could somebody ever do this? This is how. They lean to one side. They find a group that thinks just like them. They only talk to people in that group. Their views get more and more extreme, in some cases to the point where they're willing to be violent, to support their ideas because they see the other viewpoints as an enemy, as us versus them. Okay? So the internet's a new invention, right? It's only been around for a few decades. So it connects like-minded people across the world. People that would never have been able to form groups before can now form groups, and allows them to pool their ideas, right? And form those bubbles, right? Or the echo chambers, as it's been called. So in these echo chambers of the virtual world, just like in the real world, separation plus conversation leads to polarization. Okay. This image, this grainy image, depicts. So basically, each point here in this is a blog on the internet, right? And the blue ones are liberal, the red ones are conservative. And what we see, the lines are connecting what each of the blog links to. And you'll notice all the liberal blogs link to all the other liberal blogs. It's hard to say. All the conservative blogs link to all the other conservative blogs, and there's only some overlap we see in the middle. But this is a really good depiction of polarization on the internet in terms of blogs. Okay, and you see that if you only attend this blog, you might get linked here, 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 here. You're unlikely to get linked to a conservative blog. So what ends up happening is you're only chatting with people in your group, and your viewpoints are going to get more and more extreme, and that's going to happen on both sides. And these two groups are going to get further and further apart, which is what polarization is. And eventually you have this us versus them mindset, which we find ourselves in 2020 right now, right? You probably hear it all the time, right? The country's never been more polarized than it is now. Well, the internet's very new, right? Group polarization is not new. That's been happening since there were groups. But this idea of the internet, right? Allowing people to group together from across the country, from across the world, right? All of a sudden, geographical limitations aren't a thing because of the internet. If we think about climate change skeptics, people that have believed they've been abducted by aliens, conspiracy theorists, right? That where do they find their support? On the internet. White supremacists, where do they find their support now? Right? On the internet. The internet has revived white supremacy and these different conspiracy theorists, right? White supremacists go on the internet. What do they see? Other white supremacists, and when they have conversations, they become more racist. They become more polarized. They become more set in their views. However, right, it's not all bad. The internet's not evil, right? Because peacemakers, cancer survivors, bereaved parents, they can also go onto the internet and find strength and solace from kindred spirits, other people that they wouldn't have been able to connect to, right? So new technologies, there's always going to be negative and positive things that consequences that come out of them, right? The technologies themselves are not evil. Just like science is not evil. It's not good or evil, right? It's how things are used, okay? So you can't call the technology itself evil because we see, we get good things that come out of it, we get bad things that come out of it. So, right, by linking and magnifying the inclinations of like-minded people, the internet can be really bad or really good, right? So it's not the internet itself, it's how it's used. Okay, so groupthink. Groupthink is this idea that it's a way of thinking that occurs with the desire for harmony within a group. So a group's trying to make a decision. Groupthink comes in when the group really is just focused on, let's make it so everyone agrees, rather than coming up with the best option, right, or the best solution, or even a realistic solution. Okay, the groupthink is when a group decides on something because everybody agrees, and it's nice when everybody agrees. Everyone's friendly. Everyone's like, yeah, we're all on the same page, sure. But because of that, you don't look at the better options, the better solutions to a problem. So just some examples, right? The failure to anticipate the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? It was an idea, but it was shot down because of groupthink. The escalation of the Vietnam War. These are just all examples where a group of people came together, right, and went with the harmonious decision over the best decision. The Watergate cover-up, the Chernobyl nuclear reaction accident, the Challenger explosion, the Iraq War, right, launched on the false idea that they had weapons of mass destruction. So groupthink comes in over and over and over again, and it's, again, remember, it's basically the want to have that harmony in the group overrides the most logical and like pragmatic solution to a problem. Okay, so we've just seen so it's like, how can I overcome this, right? If I'm in a group, it's like, how can I not become susceptible to this groupthink or polarization or all these things that are pulling me in all these different directions that seem like you don't have free will anymore. Well, right, the social control and personal control. So social control is the power of the situation. Personal control is the power of the individual. They interact. So the power of the individual does exist. For example, let's think about history. If you are a committed individual in a minority group, you can sway the majority and make social history. It's happened in the past. Rosa Parks in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Gandhi's nonviolent appeals, right, that led to India's independence in 1947. So if you're a minority, you're far more likely to sway the majority if you hold your position firmly and do not waffle. Waffle means to that's kind of like flip-flop, right? Kind of like, I'm going to make a concession here, and maybe this is not exactly how No, you have to be firm in your position, right? If Rosa Parks sat in her seat, didn't get up, and then the third time she was bullied and asked, and then she got up and moved, we wouldn't even know her name, right? Okay. So what happens? Why does that work, right? Why do you need to hold firm? Well, people in that majority group, they privately develop sympathy for the minority position and then become slightly more open-minded. They begin to rethink their own views when they see this person like, wow, that person is really set, like they're so sure of their position. Maybe I should kind of think about that a little bit more. And that's how social change happens, especially when the social change is coming from a minority position. Okay. All right, so take a moment and just make sure you got these ideas of group polarization and groupthink down, and then, assess the power of the individual to overcome these things. Okay, so cultural influences. I'm going to wrap it up here with cultural influences. So how do our cultural norms affect our behavior? So real quick, right, if you need a working definition for culture, it's the behaviors, ideas, attitudes, values, traditions that are shared by a group of people and that are transmitted from one generation to the next, right? Thanks to our mastery of language, right? I don't know if I've said that. I think I've said this many times, but right, language is like the best thing humans have done. Like, we're the best at language, right? It's one of the most special things about humans. So because of language, we enjoy what's called the preservation of innovation, right? You didn't have to invent the cell phone. You didn't have to invent the computer that you're watching this video on. You didn't have to invent videos. You didn't have to invent blah, 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 on and on and on. You don't know how to build a house? That's fine. Other people do, right? This preservation of innovation that gets passed down is because of language, right? How else would we be able to teach other people how to do things, right? It's through language right now. It's happening right now. So it also enables culture, also enables an efficient division of labor, right? And this kind of goes with the idea of preservation of innovation, right? You don't have to build a house. You can just buy one or rent one or whatever. You don't have to know how to run the train. Somebody else does that, right? You get on the train, you don't have to think about that, right? We have a division of labor. People have different jobs within a culture. So what about variation between cultures or across culture? So each cultural group has its own norms, right? These are rules for accepted and expected behavior. They help us, they kind of free us from self-preoccupation, right? We don't have to think as much about how we're acting, right? It kind of greases the social machinery. It gives us a way to, kind of like a rule book or, guidelines of interacting with other people. And when those cultures collide, right, it can be a little awkward. This is not the best example, but it's like, maybe you have somebody that doesn't handshake, right? They only give hugs, and you're like, oh, okay, well, I miss handshakes, right? So that little bit, that's one example, but there's, millions more. When we don't understand what's expected or accepted within a culture, right? So if we kind of leave our culture and go somewhere else, maybe visiting a foreign country, we can experience what's called culture shock. One example, right, U.S. Peace Corps volunteers, these are members that are sent all over the world to help into all different cultures, usually to help in some way. Two of their greatest culture shocks were, after the language differences, of course, right, were differing pace of life and differing sense of punctuality, right? So the speed at which life moves and the sense at which, people show up for things at what time. Those were the two most common culture shock things. What about over time, right? Not just between cultures, but over time, even within the same culture. So, right, cultures vary and compete for resources, and that means they're going to change over time. Middle-class people today can fly to places that middle-class people, a few decades ago could only read about. Maybe more than a few decades ago, but you understand. We enjoy the convenience of air conditioning, online shopping, electronic communication. We eat out, Americans eat out more than twice as often as their grandparents did back in 1960. Minority groups enjoy expanded human rights, right? Obviously more work to do, but it has gotten much better. Today's women often marry more often for love and less of them endure abusive relationships. Right? There's a positive change. Negative change. The U.S. today has more divorce and depression. Right? North Americans specifically spend more hours at work, fewer hours with friends and family, and fewer hours asleep. Okay, so this is just different ways that culture can change over time and thus affect our behavior. And I'm sure you can think of more examples for how cultures change over time, right? Just a quick run through. So that's going to be it. So take a minute, right? Make sure you can kind of describe how cultural norms affect our behavior, either between cultures or across time or within a culture. And then you got another check for understanding question there. So you can pause on this. Here are a couple FRQs. Go ahead and try those. And go ahead and do the homework and call it a day. All right, I will see you tomorrow or whenever the next lesson is.